2005 Honda Pilot. Valves need to be adjusted. I'm Brian Eslick from How To Automotive. I'm going to walk you through that process. So to get started, we're just going to remove our upper engine cover. And you may notice in the video that a few things are disconnected, but that's because I'm doing a previous repair. So I'll tell you step by step what you need to do. So after you get the engine cover off, go ahead and take the air box and inlet tube here off. So you'll unbolt it here, and the screws holding that on, and then we have a squeeze clamp here and pull the hose out, set aside. So we need to get this upper plenum off so we can get to the valve covers and remove the valve covers. So what I like to do is take the throttle body off. So I'll take off the four bolts to hold the throttle body here on, and I'll leave as much, like all the hoses and the as much electrical connectors and everything connected as I can, and I'll just slide it off and set it aside. So now that you got your throttle body just off and just tucked aside, you can go ahead and disconnect your temp sensor here. You can take the two 10mm bolts out here on the purge line or purge valve, and unhook the hose here, and just kind of don't even unplug the electrical system, just let it hang down here. Take off your vacuum booster line, and then on the opposite side of the plenum here, I would take this hose off here at the bottom and leave it hooked up on the top. Now that you got all that unplugged and disconnected, take out the 12 bolts, and there's a couple nuts on here too, off this top cover, and take the top cover off. Now you want to take out the 7 bolts and 2 nuts that are here. Don't take out the 2 10s here, leave those alone. After removing the bolts, you can just lift the plenum off and set aside. When you go to order your gaskets, you'll have to get 2 of these gaskets because this is aluminum block and underneath is another gasket. So right now I'm just going to leave it on. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take rags and kind of stuff it in here and cover all the ports, so that way when we're working on the rest of the job here, that helps prevent anything from falling in there and causing a future problem. So go ahead and do that. Then after that, unplug the ignition coils and take the Allen bolts out, and take the coils out on front and back valve covers. Go ahead and do that. And then also we can go ahead and take out the 10mm that hold the bracket, the wire loom down to the top of the valve cover. Go ahead and remove that. There's going to be a couple of those on the back valve cover also. There's one here, and what I like to do, you just kind of feel for them because it's kind of like a blind thing, and there's a couple of them behind here. So take those off too. Okay, after getting all of our coils out and our loom unbolted here on front and rear, I'm going to put our focus back towards the front valve cover first. Go ahead and get this one off. And so what I'm going to do is right here on the driver's side of the car, right next to the EGR valve here, there's 2 electrical connectors, one for the oxygen sensor and one for the actual motor mount. Disconnect those, and right here is where the wire loom is attached to a bracket. We're going to pop that out, and once we do that, this whole wire loom will flip out of the way. So now we got everything unplugged. You can just fold the wiring harness over and set it aside like that. Now we can go ahead and pull our dipstick out on the front valve cover here, set that aside, and you can go ahead and start removing the 10mm bolts around the valve cover. So after removing the 5 bolts, you may have to use like a little pry bar, like right here in the corner, and just pry it up, just a light little pry, glue itself to the cylinder head a little bit, and then just lift it off. So now the back valve cover is a little bit more difficult. So we already unbolted the 2 bolts that actually hold it on. There's only one right here and one here in the corner, and got our coils all unplugged. So what we need to do is we need to unplug the injectors here, unplug the 3 injector wire looms, and then over here on the side you need to pop this little tab, and pull the wire loom off of its little perch there. And also there's going to be a little perch here where this green one is here, and you'll lift that one off too. We're going to get slack, and we're going to just lift it up as high as we can get it. Okay, now that we got the wire loom off the little perch there over here, like I said, and we got some play in it, and you got your injectors disconnected, you can pull the wiring harness back now, And you can see the power steering hose that goes along. There's a bracket attached to it. You need to take that 10mm off. And then also here on the driver's side, you need to take this vent line off. Also on the back timing cover, if you pull the wire loom out of the little groove that it's in, pull it out. That gives you a little bit more slack too. And also what I've also found is, because what we're going to do is we're going to unbolt it next, and we're going to just lift it up as high as we can and slide it out from underneath the wiring harness. I've found that if you take this little 10mm bolt right behind this little ear here, if you take that off and take this bracket off, it reduces the risk of snagging the wiring harness, and it eases in it coming out of the car. So take that off and just set it aside too. And there's one more of these green mounts right here. It's on the driver's side. Down below, if you pop it off the earlobe, now you can really maneuver the wiring harness out of the way. So now you can get to your 5 bolts to hold the valve cover on. So go ahead and remove those and pop the valve cover up. So I was able to lift the wiring harness up just high enough to kind of snake the old valve cover out, just like that. Now that I got the valve cover off, I see there's a 12mm bolt holding this little bracket on, and if you was to take that out, you probably can get even more lift out of the wiring harness. Okay, now that we got the valve covers off, now we're ready to proceed to adjust the valves on the car. So the first step we need to do is get the car at top dead center, cylinder number 1. So to do that, what you want to do is have a setup like this on your crank pulley. So you're going to need a 19mm. In this case, it's a 19mm. And extension, so you can, and there was a shield here, I took it down. So you're going to rotate your engine clockwise, and then there's 2 alignment marks that you need to line up to know when you're at top dead center. So on the crank pulley, on the inside lip, there's going to be a little notch, and it's a little hard to see, but my screwdriver is touching it. So you're going to look for the notch. And then above it is a little triangle on the cover. So the notch, you want the last notch. There's like 4 notches in a row. There's like a red one. It's the white one with the white mark on it. It's marked white, and it's going to be the one furthest to your left on the pulley. And then there's a triangle on the cover. So you want the notch, the tip of the notch, and the tip of the triangle to line up. Once you get that, to verify that you're on top dead center and not 180 out, you're going to take this little plug. It's on the cylinder cover, timing cover, and remove it out of your way. And inside that plug, you'll see a number 1, and then there's a little alignment hash marks that are right there, and they should align. And that's the cover closest to the radiator. So if you see the hash mark lines there, and the number 1 in the wheel here on the cam, and the alignment mark below lines up, you know you're at top dead center, number 1 cylinder. So before we actually make our first adjustment, we want to make sure that the engine is completely cold, below 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the cylinder heads themselves. And so now we're gonna follow the factory process on how to adjust the valves, and I got this information courtesy of All Data. If you guys don't have All Data in your shop, it's a good tool to have. It's a great source of information. So now that we got it lined up on number 1, like it says here in the diagram, we're going to adjust intake and exhaust valves on cylinder number 1, which is going to be the furthest one in here in the back. So you're going to have to maneuver the wiring harness in and out of your. So when you start adjusting these, you need to know which one's the intake and which one's the exhaust valves. Okay, so easiest way to tell is the valves that are closest to the exhaust manifold itself are going to be the exhaust intakes, and the valves that are closest to the intake runner is going to be the intake valves. So the feeler gauges I like to use is what they call a go or no go, meaning this is the exact size you want at the very tip, and if you slide it in, it gets thicker. So if you're adjusting your valve and you slide it in and it fits nice and smooth, and then you get to the thicker part and it will not go, that means that's pretty much the proper adjustment that helps you gauge it. So I also like to use a combination of the straight ones and the ones with the little 45-degree bends, because some of them are kind of difficult to get to, and so it's best to have a combination of different ones. Some of them have clear shots to get in there, and it's really easy to get to and check. And some of them are you have to kind of angle them and stuff like that. Now, the hard part to explain on the valve adjusting is it's done by feel. So the best way I can tell you is once you get this slid underneath the tip of the feeler gauge slid underneath the valve in the rocker, you want to feel a drag. It's kind of like if you take the tip of it and you pinch it, and then you try to pull it out of your fingers. That's kind of how the feel you want when you're adjusting. Now you'll know if it's too tight. The too tight's easy because the feeler gauge absolutely will not slide in. It's just too tight and it won't go in. But too loose, it's a different thing. So when you put your gauge under, you want it as flat as you can be, because if you have any angles like this, it can give you a false reading, and you can have the valves too loose. Okay, so our spec for the intake exhaust and intake in millimeters is 0.20 millimeters and a maximum of 0.24 millimeters. Or if you like to read them in inches, it's 0.008 inches to 0.009 inches. So you have a little bit of a play. There's a variance of how thick or loose you can get them. If you're going to err on the loose side. If tight valves burn the valves. So now we're going to get started. Now that this cylinder head is lined up to number 1, we're going to adjust intakes to 20 to the specs here you see, and then after that we adjust that. We'll adjust the exhaust on the same valve, and then we're going to rotate the engine. So I got my feeler gauge with the proper, and I got it underneath cylinder number 1 here, and as you can see how easily I can move it around. That indicates that the valve is too loose. So we're going to loosen the 10mm nut here, and then screw the slotted screw inwards until this has a light drag. So if you have room, you can use a tool like this. And it has a wrench and a socket and a screwdriver kind of built into one. So you can slide it over it like that, and then you can use the handle to crack the nut free, and then you can use the screwdriver part here to loosen or tighten your valve. If you don't have that, a good old-fashioned wrench and flathead screwdriver works just fine. And then, so what you're going to do is you're going to loosen it, adjust it to where the feeler gauge has the drag, and then you're going to snug it up with this. And then what you're going to do is you're going to torque it down with a torque wrench to 14 foot-pounds, the lock nut to 14 foot-pounds. And then you're going to recheck it, because sometimes when you tighten them up, things move a little bit and the adjustment will go out. So you may have to loosen this up, tighten it, do this several times until you're confident that everything feels like it's sliding back and forth the way it's supposed to. So you're going to feel that drag. So after adjusting both valves on cylinder number 1 on the intake side, now you got to get back here and do the valves on the exhaust. And this one is tight, so the exhaust valves are tight on this car. So when you're adjusting these, you try not to twist them in any way. You want them as level as you can be, and you want to feel that drag. So this one's a little on the tight side. I can barely move it at all. So I'm going to loosen it just a hair, and then I'll tighten the jam nut on top. Here I'll tighten that, and then I'll recheck. And after I final torque down, you recheck again, because I'm finding that when you tighten the nut, it tends to tighten the valve up a little bit too. So sometimes you'll have to back it off where it's actually a little loose. The feeler gauge is a little loose, but when you tighten the nut, it tightens it up a little bit. So you kind of have to play with it back and forth until you find that magic way it feels. You may have to do this several times on each valve. So there's 2 valves per intake and 2 valves per exhaust. So adjust both intake and exhaust on the number 1, and then after we get that, you're done with that, I'm going to show you how to rotate the engine to the next cylinder that you're going to adjust. So our next step after you got your first cylinder adjusted is rotate the engine clockwise until you see the number 4. And so you'll rotate the engine clockwise, and then when the mark lines up here again, and it has the number 4, and the inside here is the next cylinder you're going to adjust. So it'll look just like that. You'll see the number 4 and the mark will line up. And the way I did it was I rotated the crank, and then I had a partner help me, and he watched up here until and you see rotate it clockwise really slow until the cam mark lines up. Now that it's actually on the number 4, we're actually going to adjust the number 4 cylinder. So that's going to be the one closest to the, as you can see here in my diagram here, to the front of the car. So it's going to be on the passenger side front. So you're going to adjust your intake and your exhaust here, just like you did the one on there. And then after that, I'll walk you through the next step. So after adjusting number 4 intake and exhaust valves, if they were loose or tight, I'm finding that the intakes were loose and the exhausts were tight on mine. You may find the same as yours. So next step is to rotate the engine clockwise again until in the wheel here it's lined up with the hash again, and number 2, it'll say number 2 cylinder, and it'll look just like that. So now we'll refer back to our diagram. The cylinder number 2 is going to be the one in the middle here. So you'll adjust the intake and exhaust and check those. You always check them. You don't just assume that they're loose or tight. Just if they're snug, you know, with the feeler gauge, you don't have to adjust them. Just so use your feeler gauge and feel them out. And if they're loose or tight, then make your adjustments accordingly. So I'm finding that my flashlight, the feeler gauge with the little 45 and just a flat blade screwdriver, a shorty, and a ratchet like this has been working out the best so far, the easiest to get in there. So now that you got cylinder number 2 adjusted, now you're going to rotate the engine clockwise again until you see the number 5 in the window, and it's going to look like that. So now we need to adjust cylinder number 5, which is going to be the middle one on the front cylinder head. So we'll adjust the intakes and exhaust valves, or check them. So after adjusting number 5, we're going to rotate our engine clockwise until you see number 3 line up in the wheel on the cam, and it's going to look like that. So now we're going to adjust cylinder number 3, which is going to be the one on the back cylinder head closest to the driver. So over here. So we're going to adjust our intake and exhaust. So after adjusting cylinder number 3, the next one is you're going to rotate the engine clockwise until you see cylinder number 6 line up in the cam wheel, and that's going to look like that. The number 6 cylinder is going to be the one closest to the radiator on the on the driver's side, and so you'll adjust your intake and your exhaust valves. So it'll be right here. So go ahead and adjust those. So that's after adjusting number 6. That's your last cylinder to do. Now all you need to do is clean up your mating surfaces on the cylinder heads, and put your new gaskets and tube seals in your valve covers. So now I'm prepping my valve covers. So I've pulled out the old gasket from there, and I took a flat blade screwdriver and I kind of hammered it in between the seal, and you pull it, and then you can pry it up and pop it out like that. So take all the seals out and then put your new seals in. When you get your new seal, you put it in like so, and you'll just drive it in with a hammer until it's flush. So now that we've driven our tube seals back into place, we need to put our gasket on. And you want to look at the gasket, and the new gasket will have this make sure that points upwards towards you, and then they have these little notches. So you'll line it up with the notch and push it in, and then you'll feed your gasket around. And if you get around to this side and this notch doesn't line up here, then that means that the gasket's 180 out and you have to flip it around. So go ahead and put your gasket on and feed it around. After you get your valve cover, gasket, and tube seal all set up, now you want to change over your the grommets that go on the bolts. You know, the best way to do it is just put it in a vise and kind of hammer these out with a brass hammer. And and then put your new grommet on. And if you don't do that, it'll leak. Oil will leak through the bolt holes where they used to ride, so they'll change those out. So we're going to tackle the easy one first and put the front one on first. After cleaning up the mating surfaces, just take your valve cover, and you don't need any silicone or anything like that, and you put it on over the tube seals and kind of give it a push down, and then you can start all your bolts around and tighten it up. A little tip is after you get your valve cover in place, you can take your mirror like this and run it on the edge, and you can see and double check that the gasket didn't fall off in the process of changing it. This one held on pretty tight. It's pretty snug in the actual gasket, so you probably don't have to worry about it. But just in case, I like to just check with the mirror so as you can see if the gasket's in there. Okay, after you get the bolts all bolted up, I wanted to remind you to torque it down in the pattern like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, kind of like that, like inside out. And then go ahead and put your coils in and bolt those in. Now that your coils are all bolted up on the front cover, we can go ahead and flip our wiring harness back down, put our bolts back in, and plug everything back in that we unplugged here. And put your dipstick back in. Okay, so now it's time to put the rear valve cover back on. And the best way to do this is get somebody to help you and have them hold the wiring harness up for you while you take the valve cover, and you want to make sure the nipple is pointing, back towards that, so you don't want to put it in backwards or anything. You'll figure it out real quick if you do. But so you want to slide it in like this, and then you kind of rotate it in, and then put it back into place while somebody holds the wiring harness out of your way. And then once you get it in there, go ahead and just bolt it up and put your coils in and bolt that up. So after getting your valve cover in, bolted in, your coils bolted up and plugged in, now what I like to do is kind of start from this side of the valve cover back. Anything you touched or unplugged on this side, plug it back in, and go ahead and remount your mounting bolts for your bracket. And you also have to put this ear that you took off back on here, and then remount that. And then the bracket for the power steering hose, go ahead and remount that, and make sure you plug in your injectors. I'm gonna go ahead and do that right now. So after you get all that done, then after that we're going to change out our gaskets for the plenum here and put our plenum back on. Okay, before I change out my gaskets, what I'm going to do is take my flashlight and just walk my way around the engine, anywhere I've touched, and double check everything is plugged in. And you want to make sure all the wire looms are tucked back into, like in the cover here. You want to make sure that's all plugged in, everywhere is plugged in. And then if that's all good, then you can change your gaskets, and you just take the plenum and just set it back on top. So after getting the plenum on, you put your bolts in and run them down, and you can torque them at 16 foot-pounds, and you'll start from the in and you'll work your way from the middle out like that. So it's kind of like a crisscross pattern. Okay, now you can change out the gasket here and put the cap back on, and torque those bolts down to 8 foot-pounds. So now that that's all torqued down, you can go ahead and reinstall all the hoses, your throttle body, and tighten that up. Okay, now that everything's bolted back up, go ahead and put your air cleaner assembly on, and you can put your top engine cover on. So after getting all the covers back on, fire her off and go give her a good test drive. And that completes the how to adjust valves on a 2005 Honda Pilot with a 3.5 liter engine. I'm Brian Eslick from How To Automotive. I'd like to thank you guys for watching my videos, and remind you to subscribe for more valuable tips like this. Thank you again.